What you're about to witness is a story so powerful, so emotionally charged, that it will leave you breathless until the very last word. A billionaire who swore he'd never fall in love, a secret that could destroy everything, and a twist that will shatter your expectations. If you love stories that grip your heart and refuse to let go, hit that subscribe button right now, because you won't want to miss a single story we share. This one? It has an ending you absolutely won't believe. Seattle. Drowned in sheets of autumn rain and neon lights reflected off puddles on Pike Street. Marcus, a 32-year-old billionaire and one of the most influential investors in the country, sat in the corner of an exclusive hotel bar. For him, the world was simple. It consisted of numbers, charts, and cold calculations. Love, marriage, children, these were concepts Marcus considered unnecessary, complications in the well-oiled machine of his life. "Another whiskey, double," he said curtly to the bartender, not taking his eyes off his tablet screen. An evening like this deserves something better than just work and bitter alcohol. He suddenly heard a melodious voice right next to him. He looked up, ready with a sharp retort, but the words stuck in his throat. Next to him stood a woman of rare beauty, but it wasn't the artificial beauty he knew from Seattle's salons. She had deep, intelligent eyes and a smile that seemed to dispel the gloom pervading the room. Her name was Grace. They started talking. What began as casual conversation transformed into an hours-long discussion that seemed to have no end. Grace was an architecture student, full of passion and belief that designing buildings meant creating spaces for human happiness. Marcus, fascinated by her energy, allowed himself a honesty he'd avoided for years. "Don't believe in fairy tales, Grace," he said with conviction. "I build empires, not homes. Freedom is the only thing that has value to me. I'll never get married, and children are the last thing I dream about." Grace laughed softly, and that sound struck Marcus's heart harder than any stock transaction. "You're wrong, Marcus. You talk about loneliness as if it were a medal. I dream of something completely different. I want a home full of life, someone to share every day with. But first, I have to finish school and take care of my mom, who means everything to me." That night, the attraction between them became impossible to control. In Marcus's luxurious suite, time stood still. For a few hours, the billionaire's cold cynicism vanished under Grace's touch. He felt this night was different from all the previous ones. In the early morning, while Marcus still slept, Grace's phone vibrated on the nightstand. The message from Portland was dramatic. Her mother had suffered a heart attack and was in critical condition. Panicked, with tears in her eyes, Grace gathered her things. She looked at the sleeping man who had promised never to love anyone and felt a painful prick in her heart. She left no note, no phone number. She had to run. When Marcus woke up and found the empty bed, he felt a strange emptiness. He only knew her first name. For many months, he subconsciously searched for her face in crowds on Seattle's streets. But life went on. He didn't yet know that this one evening had changed his destiny forever. More than a year passed. For Marcus, it was a time of intense work, successive financial successes, and emotional emptiness he'd grown accustomed to. Though other women appeared in his life, none could erase the memory of that night and the scent of Grace's perfume. She became his private ghost, an elusive memory that haunted him at the most inappropriate moments. His company's headquarters, located in one of the most modern towers in downtown Seattle, pulsed with life. The firm was growing at lightning speed, which required hiring new support staff. Marcus rarely participated in recruitment for lower positions, but that day, bored by a dull board meeting, he decided to review documents for candidates for the new executive secretary position. When he opened the folder labeled Grace Morgan, his heart stopped beating for a moment. The same intelligent eyes from the bar a year ago looked at him from the photograph. There was no doubt. It was her. "Let the next person in," he said through the intercom, and his voice, usually confident and strong, trembled slightly. The office door opened quietly. Grace walked in with a confident step, dressed in a modest but elegant white blouse and dark skirt. She looked more mature, and her face, though still beautiful, bore traces of fatigue and worry. When she looked up and saw who sat behind the desk, her face instantly paled. For a moment, silence so thick you could cut it with a knife filled the office. You're the CEO?" she stammered, clutching her purse. Marcus stood up slowly, not taking his eyes off her. "Grace, I looked for you. Why did you disappear, without a word that night?" He expected tears, explanations, maybe even joy. But what he saw in her eyes was a coldness he'd never experienced from her before. Grace straightened up, adopting a mask of professionalism harder than granite. "I'm sorry, Mr. President, but are we discussing my professional qualifications?" she asked in a voice devoid of emotion. "If so, my documents are in order. If not, I'm afraid we're wasting time. What happened a year ago was a mistake resulting from a moment of weakness. I ask that we treat each other solely as employer and employee." Marcus was shocked. This distance hurt him. He tried to move closer, but she stepped back. "Grace, let's talk like people. That night doesn't exist," she cut him off firmly. "I need this job, Mr. President. My life situation is complicated. If you can't separate the past from professional duties, I'll walk out of here right now." Marcus, despite growing frustration and a million questions swirling in his head, nodded. He needed her close, even if she would only be a cold assistant. "Fine, you start Monday. But don't think I've forgotten." Grace nodded, threw out a brief "thank you," and left, leaving him in vapors of unanswered questions. He didn't see how in the hallway her legs buckled under the weight of emotions, and her hand went to the necklace that hid a secret he had no idea about yet. Working in Marcus's office, suspended high above downtown Seattle, was like walking on exceptionally, thin ice that cracked with every louder breath. Grace was the embodiment of perfection, always punctual, organized, and painfully professional, which for Marcus was almost torture. Every morning, when sunlight reflected off the glass facades of skyscrapers, she entered his office with a cup of strong coffee and a set of documents to sign. Her movements were fluid, but devoid of their former lightness, and her gaze never lingered on his eyes longer than a fraction of a second, as if she were afraid that a look might betray some closely guarded secret. Marcus, a man who in the business world was famous for being able to sense an opponent's weakness and win even the most hopeless negotiation, now felt completely helpless. The coldness with which Grace surrounded herself was tighter than armor. It irritated him immensely. In his head, images from over a year ago still pulsed. Her laugh, the way she wrinkled her nose during jokes, and that incredible closeness that had seemed so real. Now, however, he saw before him only a perfect working machine that answered every private question with an icy, "Do you have any other work-related instructions, Mr. President?" One afternoon, when the sky over the city took on the color of deep purple and office building lights began to flicker like distant stars, Marcus couldn't take it anymore. Grace was just gathering folders from the conference table, preparing to leave. "Grace, enough of this," he said firmly, standing up from his desk and taking several quick steps toward her to block her path to the door. "I'm not a robot, and you're not just a number on the payroll. I remember that evening in the bar. I remember every minute of our conversation, every topic we discussed. Why do you treat me like a stranger? Or even worse, like an enemy? Did I do something that hurt you so deeply?" Grace froze, and her hands clenched the leather folder so tightly that her knuckles turned white. For a moment, brief as the blink of an eye, pain and regret flashed in her eyes that she couldn't hide under her professional mask. "You didn't do anything wrong, Marcus," she said quietly, and her use of his first name made the room suddenly lack oxygen. "But that night was part of another life, a dream I had to brutally wake up from. Now my life looks different. I have different priorities and obligations you have no idea about. My mom still requires costly treatment and rehabilitation, and I have to take care of what's most precious to me. Please, don't ask anything more. It doesn't make sense and leads nowhere." "Why doesn't it make sense?" he pressed, moving even closer. He could smell her perfume, the same as a year ago, but now underscored with a note of sadness. "I felt something then that I'd never experienced before. I thought you felt it too, that this meeting was destiny." Grace looked at him with undisguised bitterness, and her voice trembled with suppressed emotions. "Destiny? You told me yourself that you'd never want a family, that you don't believe in love, and that children are just a burden on your freedom. Remember that?" Her eyes glazed over with tears she didn't want to shed. "You're a successful man, Marcus. Your world is freedom and lack of commitment. My world is built on sacrifice. These two worlds have no common ground." Before he could protest, Grace's phone in her purse began vibrating violently. She looked at the screen, and her face instantly turned chalk white. "I have to go. It's very late." "I'll be late. I need to pick someone up. I need to be home," she stammered chaotically, and nearly ran out of the office, leaving a stunned Marcus in the mute silence of the tower. Marcus stood by the window, looking at the string of cars on Seattle's streets. He felt in his bones that Grace was hiding something fundamental from him, something that had turned the joyful student into a woman carrying the whole world on her shoulders. He decided that this time he wouldn't let her just disappear. He didn't yet know that the truth he would discover would shatter his entire worldview. A few days after the stormy conversation in the office, Marcus couldn't find peace. The image of pale Grace running from the office haunted him during every business meeting. That afternoon, instead of staying after hours, he decided to leave the parking garage early. Intuition, that same instinct that allowed him to predict stock market moves, told him to follow the taxi Grace got into. He followed her through congested downtown streets until they reached a quieter residential neighborhood where modern apartment buildings neighbored old parks. Grace got out in front of a small, colorful building with a sign reading Rainbow Daycare and Nursery. Marcus parked a bit farther away, and his heart began beating in a rhythm he couldn't control. He got out of the car, feeling that something was about to happen that would forever change the trajectory of his life. He saw her after a few minutes. She came out of the building carrying a small bundle wrapped in a blue blanket. She walked toward a nearby square, and her entire posture, previously so stiff and cold in the office, now radiated infinite tenderness. Marcus followed at a safe distance until Grace sat on a bench in a secluded corner of the park, away from the city's hustle. When he approached closer, he saw him. The boy was about 5 months old. He sat on his mother's lap, waving small hands and making joyful sounds. He had thick, dark hair and facial features that were like looking in a mirror from Marcus's childhood. The same nose shape, the same jawline, but it was the child's eyes, deep, intelligent, and keenly observing the world, that took Marcus's breath away. Grace froze when Marcus's shadow fell on her hands. She looked up, and he saw pure, primal fear in her eyes. She clutched the infant tighter to her chest, as if wanting to shield him from the whole world. "Marcus, what are you doing here?" Her voice was barely audible, soaked with panic. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He stared at the child, feeling how the walls he'd built around his heart for decades were crumbling and turning to dust. All his cynicism, his theories about freedom and aversion to commitment, evaporated in 1 second under the influence of the innocent gaze of the infant. "He's mine, isn't he?" he asked, and his voice, usually so confident, now broke completely. Grace bit her lip, trying to hold back tears. Seeing there was no escape, she slowly nodded. "His name is Owen. I found out about the pregnancy after I got back to Portland. When Mom ended up in the hospital, everything collapsed. Marcus, I had no way to find you. And then I remembered your words. You said you'd never be a father, that children are a burden to you. I was afraid you'd take him away from me or despise him, and I couldn't allow that. I moved to Seattle to earn money for Mom's treatment and secure his future. Marcus sank onto the bench next to her, hiding his face in his hands. He felt devastated. For 5 months his son had lived in this world, and he didn't know. He wasn't there for his birth, didn't hold his hand, didn't support Grace in the hardest moments of her life. The pain and guilt were almost physical. I'm so sorry, Grace, he finally croaked, looking at little Owen, who was now reaching out toward his shiny watch. I had no idea who I could become until I saw him. I won't let you suffer anymore, I swear. In that moment, under the old chestnut trees of the Seattle park, the heartless billionaire ceased to exist. A man was born who now had only one goal: to regain the trust of the woman he loved and become the father this boy deserved. The silence that fell on the bench in the Seattle park was different from the one in the office. It was no longer icy but full of the weight of unspoken words and regret. Marcus still stared at little Owen, who now, tired from waving his hands, rested his head on Grace's shoulder and began slowly closing his eyes. This sight, so fragile and defenseless, caused Marcus to feel a pain in his heart that was simultaneously cleansing. How could you think I'd reject him? Marcus asked, and his voice was now quiet, devoid of arrogance. Yes, I said all those things in the bar. I was a fool who thought money and lack of commitment were the definition of freedom. But Grace, that was before I met you. Before that night changed everything I knew about myself. Grace looked at him, and uncertainty still smoldered in her eyes. For the past months, she'd built a wall around herself to survive. Single motherhood, her mother's illness, and working for the man who was her child's father but didn't know it had exhausted her strength. I was afraid, Marcus. You're the most powerful person I know. If I'd told you and you didn't want us, my heart would have broken. And if you'd wanted only the child and not me, that would have been even worse. Owen is my whole world. I couldn't risk his safety. Marcus moved an inch closer, placing his hand on the bench's back right next to her shoulder. From today on, you won't have to risk alone anymore. I won't allow it. Tomorrow morning, I'm sending the best specialist to your mom. If necessary, we'll bring doctors from abroad. You'll move to an apartment closer to the clinic where you'll have full care. And I'm not saying this as your boss, Grace. I'm saying this as a man who just realized that for a year, he's been chasing shadows, while his real life was happening here without him. Grace shook her head, trying to preserve the remnants of her pride. I don't want your money, Marcus. I work for myself. This isn't just money, it's responsibility. He's my son, he interrupted gently, pointing at Owen. Let me be a father. Let me fix what we lost this past year. I'm not asking you to forgive me right away. I'm just asking you to let me take care of you both. Marcus knew he had to act carefully. Grace wasn't a woman who could be bought with luxuries. He had to regain her trust through actions, not just promises. When they stood up from the bench, he helped her arrange the child in the stroller. For a moment their hands touched. It was the first voluntary touch since that night in the hotel. The spark that jumped between them was so strong that they both held their breath. That night, Marcus didn't return to his empty penthouse to drink whiskey and review reports. He sat in his car under Grace's apartment building, looking at her window until the light went out. He felt his old life, the life of a heartless billionaire, had just burned away. Something new was emerging from the ashes, a need to belong. He faced the most difficult merger of his life, combining two wounded hearts into one family. And this time, he wasn't going to lose. Seattle awakened to life in the cool morning sun. But in the luxurious Bellevue apartment that Marcus had rented for Grace and her mother, peace reigned. Marcus didn't waste time. Within just 48 hours, he'd activated all his contacts. The best cardiologist in the region, Dr. Richardson, took over the care of Grace's mother, and a private nurse watched over her around the clock. Despite this, Grace still maintained her distance. Though she accepted the help, in her eyes there still lurked the fear that this was all just a rich man's whim, who would one day get bored. Marcus, however, had no intention of giving up. Every afternoon, immediately after finishing the most important meetings in the office, he appeared at their place. He didn't come just with gifts. He came to be present. One evening, Grace found him in the living room trying to calm crying Owen. Marcus, the man who so easily managed billions, looked completely lost with an infant in his arms. Owen squirmed and cried, and Marcus, with his loosened tie and rolled-up shirt sleeves, rocked him gently, whispering something quietly under his breath. "Give him to me. I'll do it," Grace said, approaching closer. "No, please. Let me try," Marcus replied, and in his gaze was a determination she'd never seen in the office. "I have to learn this, Grace. I need to know how to comfort him when you're not around." Grace stood in the doorway, observing this scene. The sight of powerful Marcus treating little Owen with such tenderness and patience began to crush the last ice in her heart. She saw that he was really trying. He hadn't hired a team of nannies to relieve himself. He wanted to be there. He wanted to change diapers, feed, and carry his son in his arms through sleepless nights. "The professor says Mom feels better," she said quietly, sitting on the couch. "Thank you, Marcus. Without your help, she never would have gotten into that clinic." Marcus finally managed to put Owen to sleep and carefully laid him in the crib. He approached Grace and sat next to her, maintaining a safe distance. "Don't thank me. I'm the one who should thank you for even letting me be here. I know, you still don't trust me. I know you're afraid I'll remember my freedom and leave. But the truth is, I've never felt freer than now, when I'm holding him in my arms." He looked straight into her eyes, and Grace felt her resistance weakening. This man was no longer the same cynic from the bar. He was a father who had discovered his heart. "Your mom will recover, Grace, and we'll build that home you dreamed about, no matter how long it takes for you to forgive me for that night and my stupid words." For the first time in over a year, Grace fell asleep without fear of tomorrow. Marcus, meanwhile, spent the evening reading parenting guides, prepared to become for Owen and Grace the rock they'd never had. Winter in Seattle began painting white patterns on the clinic windows where Grace's mother was returning to health. Thanks to Marcus's efforts and the best medical care, Mrs. Morgan could now sit independently and smile at her grandson. This peace of mind finally allowed Grace to breathe. She stopped looking at Marcus as a threat and began to see in him a man who, with each diaper change and each sleepless night, proved that his transformation was authentic. One frosty evening, when little Owen had finally fallen asleep in his new crib, Marcus and Grace were left alone in the living room. In the fireplace, logs crackled, and outside the window, snowflakes slowly fell on Bellevue Street. Marcus brought 2 cups of hot tea and sat next to her, but this time much closer than usual. "Grace," he began quietly, looking at the dancing flames. "For the past weeks I've been thinking about what you told me that day in the office, about how our worlds don't fit together. You were right. My old world was empty and cold. But I don't want to go back to it. I want to create a new world with you and Owen." Grace set down her cup, feeling her heart speed up. "Marcus, all this happened so fast. Not long ago you were just my stern boss. And now you're here, helping my mom, taking care of our son. It's hard for me to forget what I felt during that year, about that fear that I'd be left alone." Marcus turned to her and took her hand in his. They were warm and strong. "I know I hurt you with my words in the bar, even if I didn't know then what fate would bring. But now I know one thing. I love you, Grace. I love you both more than any empire I've built. I never thought I'd be able to feel this. But without you, that money is just numbers in an account. Grace looked into his eyes and no longer saw the cold billionaire there. She saw a man who was ready to fight for his family. Her resistance, built up through months of loneliness, finally collapsed. "I love you too, Marcus," she whispered, and tears of relief flowed down her cheeks. "I was afraid to admit it, even to myself, but I never stopped thinking about you." Marcus moved closer and gently wiped the tear from her cheek. Then their lips met in the first true and promise-filled kiss. This wasn't the passionate impulse from the hotel bar anymore, but the sealing of an alliance between two souls who had found each other in the big city. That night in Seattle, a family was born, whose foundation wasn't gold, but truth and forgiveness. Winter in Seattle fully spread its white wings, and the city under a thick quilt of snow seemed calmer, as if time had slowed for a moment. For Marcus, this time was a period of the deepest transformation he'd ever undergone. Sitting in his glass-walled office, he no longer looked at stock charts with the same predatory satisfaction as before. Now his thoughts circled around the warm apartment in Bellevue, the smell of baby powder, and Grace's smile, which had become his new compass. He knew the moment had come to close the past and build a foundation for the future he'd been too afraid to even dream about a year ago. That evening, Marcus prepared something special. It wasn't an extravagant dinner in a restaurant full of camera flashes, but an intimate meeting in their new shared home, which was slowly becoming their refuge. When Grace entered the living room, she was greeted by dozens of burning candles, whose glow reflected in the windows overlooking the snow-covered gardens. Little Owen was already sleeping peacefully in his room, and Grace's mother, Mrs. Morgan, felt well enough to enjoy a quiet evening in her part of the apartment. Marcus stood by the window, dressed elegantly, but without the stiffness that once defined him. "Grace," he began as she approached him, and his voice vibrated with emotions he couldn't and didn't want to hide anymore. "A year ago in that bar, I told you I didn't believe in love, and that freedom was my only priority. I was a man who had everything but actually had nothing. I was empty inside, chasing successes that had no face or heart. But then I met you. Your courage, your strength in fighting for our son and for your mom, showed me what a person's true value is." Grace listened to him with bated breath, and her eyes shone in the candlelight. Marcus approached closer and took her hands in his. "For the past months, I've tried to prove I can be a father and partner, but I want to be more for you. I want to be the man with whom you'll always feel safe, the husband who will share every worry and every joy with you. I don't want freedom without you anymore. I want the captivity at the side of the woman who saved my soul." Marcus slowly knelt on one knee, taking out a small velvet box from his pocket. Inside sparkled a ring with a rare blue diamond, a symbol of purity and new beginnings. "Grace Morgan, will you be my wife? Will you let me officially become Owen's father and the man who until the end of his days will care for your happiness? I promise you'll never have to run or fear tomorrow again. We'll build that home you talked about, a home full of love, noise, and children's laughter." Tears flowed down Grace's cheeks, but this time they were tears of pure happiness. All the pain of the past year, the lonely nights in Portland, the fear in Seattle, and the coldness in the office, all of it vanished in one moment. She saw in Marcus not just a billionaire, but above all a man who had decided to become a better version of himself for her. "Yes, Marcus," she whispered, throwing herself into his arms. "Yes, 1,000 times yes. I love you for who you are now, and for how hard you fought for our family." Marcus slid the ring onto her finger, then hugged her so tightly, as if he wanted to protect her from the whole world. Outside the window, snowflakes whirled in a joyful dance, and inside the house, two hearts beat that had finally found their common rhythm. They knew the road ahead wouldn't always be strewn with roses, but having each other, they were ready for any challenge. Spring in Seattle arrived with unusual gentleness, bringing with it the scent of blooming magnolias and fresh hope. For Marcus and Grace, this day wasn't just another celebration on the financial elite's calendar. It was the day when their lives, torn apart by fate, finally connected into one beautiful whole. The garden of Marcus's luxurious estate outside Seattle, which had once been merely an empty space serving to impress contractors, now pulsed with life, laughter, and joy. Marcus stood before an altar built of white roses, adjusting his cufflinks. Though in his life he'd conducted hundreds of multi-million-dollar transactions, he'd never felt such nervousness as now. He looked at little Owen, who in a miniature suit sat in the arms of the smiling and fully strong Mrs. Morgan. The sight of his son, who so greatly resembled him, was for Marcus a daily reminder of the miracle he'd received from fate. When the first sounds of music rang out, he turned his head and felt his heart stop. Grace walked toward him, looking like a dream he never wanted to wake from. Her dress was simple and elegant, and in her eyes there was no longer any trace of that coldness or fear he'd seen a year earlier in his office. "You look the most beautiful in the world," Marcus whispered when she stood beside him. "That's because I'm finally home," Grace replied, with a smile that was more precious to him than all his wealth. The ceremony was intimate, full of touching words about forgiveness, patience, and the power of love that can melt even the hardest ice. When they vowed fidelity to each other, Marcus officially announced that Owen now bore his name, and he himself was donating half of his empire to charitable causes to build cardiac clinics and homes for single mothers. The billionaire who once believed only in numbers had become a philanthropist, whose greatest success was a child's happy laughter. After the reception, when the sun slowly hid behind the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Marcus and Grace stepped aside onto the viewing terrace. They watched the celebrating guests, and Owen, who was now crawling on the grass under his grandmother's watchful eye. "Do you remember what I told you that night in the bar?" Marcus asked, hugging his wife from behind. "That you'd never get married and wouldn't have children," Grace laughed, resting her head on his shoulder. "I also remember that I promised you'd have to change your mind, though I didn't think it would happen in such dramatic circumstances." Marcus turned her to face him and looked deep into her eyes. "I was blind, Grace. I thought life was about winning, not sharing. Thank you for not giving up when I was a cold jerk. Thank you for letting me become a father and husband. My life only began when I found you in that job line." Grace cupped his face in her hands. "It wasn't an accident, Marcus. It was fate that gave us a second chance, and I intend to use it every day, until the end of my days." They sealed a kiss on their lips that was a promise of eternity. In the distance, Seattle twinkled with lights, but for them, the only light that mattered was the one burning in their hearts. Marcus was no longer just a billionaire. He was rich in a completely different sense. He had love, family, and a future that smelled of spring breeze and peace. Their story, begun from one night and separated by pain, ended with the most beautiful of possible chapters, a shared life in which every moment was a treasure.